Hello, I'm Rainey and this is my third video on The Lover Upon Trial. This time I'm looking at pages 60 to 78. I'm sort of calling that chapter 3, and I do think the logical chapter end comes at page 78, but there's not really much content here, so this video will probably be quite short. All that happens from page 60 to page 78 is that they have dinner and spend a little bit of time afterwards talking. It's all in the one evening, and it all takes place after they return from their outing to the nearby town. Charles Mornington was invited to stay for tea. That must have been decided earlier because he already knew he was going to stay for tea, but originally when they got back he was going to go home and get changed and return. But because of Lydia's honeysuckle gathering episode, there's no time for him to go home, so he's forced to spend the whole evening in the clothes that he spent all day in. Whereas the others, having come back to their own house, get changed and they're all fresh and he isn't. Which means that, once again, he's at a significant disadvantage. Which is a bit sad, because really it was their doing. Lydia still isn't impressed with him, especially since he was, he washed his hands and face when he got there, but it says that he's all sort of red and hot. The clothes he had for the day are a bit too hot for the dining room, which is in the west, so they've got the sun warming the place, and then they've got the fire in the evening, so he's a bit hot. Which means he's red in the face, he's red in the hands. He didn't pick his clothes particularly well through the day. And then he has a very healthy appetite and he eats a huge amount. He's placed right opposite Lydia, and Lydia is not eating much at all because she actually just doesn't. And she'd filled up on ices and fruit in the town, so she's not very hungry and she's just sitting there watching him gorge himself. Well, that's how she is perceiving it anyway. He's also drinking a fair bit of alcohol. It seems like he can handle his alcohol, and that was this thing that a lot of books from this era did, was even when someone got really drunk, they didn't really comment on it. They didn't tell you that they'd got drunk. You can tell that once they get so drunk that they're falling over and slurring their words, and Charles Dickens was particularly good at describing that. But very often they just didn't seem to take inebriation into account. So if somebody was a little bit tipsy, you never knew it. You'd have to just pick it up by reading between the lines. So I don't know if he was, but I suspect, because what it says is, it talks of his copious potations, consisting of many tumblers of strong and superior home-brewed ale, never refusing wine when it was brought to him, not to mention the very best cup that ever was made, and I actually don't know what that's a reference to, I'll have to look that up, and repeated glasses of superlative claret at dessert. And all the while the poor man grew not celestial but terrestrial rosy red. So Lydia is watching this happening, watching him getting red in the face, even redder than he was when he started, and Lydia is obviously a bit dismayed by this. Louisa is highly entertained watching Lydia's face because Lydia is very expressive and her facial expressions tell Louisa exactly what she's thinking at every minute. And Sir William is extremely pleased with his guest and extremely pleased with the way his guest is enjoying all of the food and all of the drink, and is not seeing anything wrong with it, because really I think he's not misbehaving. I mean, he's just appreciating all the food. He was hungry. Drinking was something that everybody did. So William likes this potential son-in-law very much. Something that I found really interesting about this meal was the description of the girls' clothes, because when they got home it says they got changed in 15 minutes. Now, because they don't have a maid that helps them, and perhaps just because I've never paid much attention to it, they can freshen up very fast. So they just dashed upstairs, they changed their clothes, they washed their face and hands and gave a quick brush to their hair, and they're ready. And they look as if they've spent an hour on their toilet. It also says that they dressed themselves in clear white muslin. There's a bit of poetic hyperbole by the author here about the benefits of muslin, which I shall read out because it's kind of a bit odd. "O ye lovely ones, ye may look handsome and beautiful and elegant in dress of all hues, even bright orange, that most hideous of colours, provided ye be really handsome, beautiful, or elegant. But if ye wish to be charming, fascinating, irresistible, engaging, and lovable, clothe yourselves in yards upon yards of transparent, snowy, fresh-looking muslin." This is the first time she's used the word ye. It's obviously just because she's being poetic. And for a while there I was thinking she can't really mean transparent muslin. She's not saying that they've come down to the table in transparent muslin. But I googled it and it's true. It is basically transparent. It's just that if you wear several layers of it, you can't really see through it. And if you wear a petticoat under it that's sort of white, you also can't really tell for sure that you're wearing the petticoat under it, like what is the fabric and what isn't. And muslin is sort of nice and drapey and curtain-like. So you do kind of look like the Grecian maiden. And it says that the muslin showed off their figures. So I do think that it was basically transparent muslin. They just had their white petticoat underdress under there. And I gather that, you know, if you had a lamp behind you, then the silhouette did show off your figure quite well. And like, it's still quite respectable, especially for the home circle. But it does really highlight this difference between them, that here's Lydia looking like the perfect angel, and here he is, and he's all red-faced and a bit heavy and just eating a lot. And Lydia feels that not only is that a bit ugly of him, but that somebody who was truly in love would actually just have no appetite. She's reasoning that when she feels something strongly, eating is the last thing she wants to do. So the fact that he is eating heaps must mean that he doesn't really care for her. And she finds that thought very comforting. The meal comes to an end. The ladies leave the table, because that's what happened then. The ladies would leave the table and the men would stay eating a bit more and drinking a bit more and smoking their cigars and stuff before they joined the ladies. But because Charles basically completely loses interest in Sir William once the ladies have left the room, Sir William cuts their talk short. They join the ladies, who are outside. They've just stepped outside onto the lawn where it's cool and fresh. And Lydia would very much like to be alone, but she's just looking along the rose bushes and picking the early roses, and she can't really escape Charles, who joins her. So then they have what is the first conversation that they've had in the whole book so far. There's been a little bit of stilted talk, yeah, and he did try in the barouche, but it didn't go particularly well. But now, in the garden, after they've eaten, there's kind of no rush, and they do actually have a little bit of conversation, which doesn't go well at all. Lydia has picked 2 early roses, and he comes up and asks if she will give him one, which I gather was actually a common thing to do. Lydia gives him the rose, and she's not very impressed because he raises it to his nose to smell the fragrance, when he should apparently have raised it to his lips to kiss it. She sees this as an incorrect action. And he ruins the mood by saying that he never thinks about flowers. He says, "I had much rather go into my stables and look at my horses than visit all the conservatories in England." And then he starts chatting about his cows. He's very pleased with his cows and how he's got to show Sir William. And Lydia absolutely doesn't want to hear about cows. She cuts him off and turns and says, "What clouds?" because the clouds are piling up beautifully. And then they have a talk about clouds, which goes just as well as the previous one, where Charles is saying, you don't have to be afraid, there probably won't be a storm. And she's not really sure what to say, but she tells him how she's just been reading about clouds at Mrs. Leonard's and how these are cumulus clouds and how they remind her of the Alps. And I feel like here's the one missed opportunity, because Charles said, yes, they do look a bit like the Alps. And Lydia misses this, that he actually is saying this because he has seen the Alps, because this is where his father has had to move to for his health. And Charles has visited his father there, which I think Lydia would have been quite interested in that. But that is a topic that they completely miss. He just says, yes, it does look a bit like the Alps, but I've never paid attention to clouds before. And that puts an end to that conversation. Lydia's there thinking, neither clouds nor flowers. And she's rather wondering what they should talk about. But she makes one more attempt at conversation, and she says how when she looks at fires, she sees things there too, like Dante's Inferno. And Charles absolutely has no knowledge of this. He's got vague memories of school days in the past where he thinks he might have learned something about that, but he doesn't really remember. So there's really nothing he can talk about. And having got to this point, Lydia manages to escape him and go off on her own. There's actually quite a good page or two where she's on her own and she's thinking about how hard it would be if you had to spend your life with somebody that you were supposed to love and supposed to like, and how impossible it is to actually like or love somebody just because somebody has told you you should, and how soul-destroying it would be to be in that situation. I don't know if this is something that's come from the author's own experience, but she certainly described it very well, and it's just as applicable to today as it was to this era. So the family go inside as the evening goes on, and they have their tea and they sit down and talk in the drawing room. And Charles has broached the subject of cattle to Sir William, as he told Lydia he was going to do. And Sir William is actually very interested and plans to go and have a look at them the following morning. And Lady Middlemore introduces the subject of wild cattle, which could still be found apparently in some important estates in England at the time. And that leads to actually quite a good conversation. And it turns out Lydia is the one who has a book about that, and she offers to loan it to Charles, and her father is very pleased with her. So, as it turns out, it's Lady Middlemore that kind of saved the evening and found common ground between them all. And then Charles decides to go home, apparently earlier than visitors often would. And the author says that gentleman took his leave rather early. Whether he fancied that the one he most wished to please appeared somewhat ennuyé, as in bored, or whether he thought that, as he had been in their company since 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it was better for him to take himself away, we will not pretend to decide. But I'd like to know, because I don't know. I don't know which of those two it was. Why did he leave early? Or was it just that he'd had plenty of beer and wine and claret and now he just needed to sleep? Anyway, so he went away, and then there's a page or two about how hard it is to be. It is an awful thing, generally speaking, to be the last and still more the only departing one of a party, for there is almost invariably an immediate and universal impulse to discuss the merits or demerits of the absentee, which means that when the last person leaves and the family are on their own, they're inevitably going to talk about the guests that they've just had. But although the author tells us this is what happens, that the family will talk about the last guest to leave, she goes on to say that the Middlemores are actually a very nice family. So Charles was halfway home before anybody said a word about him. And we get a description of evening in the Middlemore household, just as we had breakfast earlier. We're told that Louisa is working industriously, which means she's sewing. When women worked, that meant women were sewing. And Lady Middlemore was at her writing table finishing a letter to one of her absent sons. So that pretty well confirms, I think, that they're away at boarding school. Sir William had a review in his hand and his own exclusive little table and candle close to him, but he held his book carelessly and his eyes were not even on it, because he's actually watching Lydia, and he asks her what she thinks, and she says that she's not thinking of anything in particular. She's just thinking in people's heads there are different proportions of mind and matter. So that some people are just kind of animalistic instinct and other people are intellectual thought. And that triggers a long and rather dull lecture from Sir William that is actually described as one of his long harangues of picked words and hesitation. So he goes on to say that matter and mind are very different things. You couldn't possibly measure them. And Lydia is forced to just sit there and listen because that's what they do. Nobody interrupts Sir William when he speaks. But it does go on to say that despite the fact that he speaks rather slowly and ponderously, Lydia does have a lot of respect for him. They all have a lot of respect for him. She even respected his weaknesses. But his speech does eventually come to an end, and Lydia then says, "Yes, I think we agree, Papa, but you must admit that if we drew the mind as though it were a mountain, Charles Mornington would be a flat plain." Sir William is not pleased at all by this, and he tells her she's too satirical and she needs to curb this tendency of hers, and calls on his wife to agree with him, which she does. And then the two parents proceed to shut Lydia down rather properly, give her a bit of a lecture on being too mean about people and how mischievous it is to make jokes about people like that. And I do agree that Lydia is mean about people. I said that before myself. I do see that. She is. She makes snap judgments about people, and if she doesn't like them, they just don't have a chance. And really, she made it so much harder for Charles Mornington today with the things that she did. But at the same time, she doesn't like him and she's being pushed to spend time with him. And if she can't actually vent to her family, then who can she vent to? So I do think she's in a tough situation here too. But they basically end in accord, and Lydia says, "I will try and form my capability of discerning the good, and I will begin with Mr. Mornington." So she's going to try, and this is actually, after today, after this talk, she actually means it. She really is going to try and find good in him now. And she does acknowledge that Charles was good to Fanny. But then Louisa says Mr. Mornington told her that he thinks Fanny is very much like Lydia, and that is the reason he's being kind to Fanny. So if that's the case, then maybe I'm not Team Charles at all, because that was what I saw as the best feature of Charles Mornington in this day. And this brings us to page 78. And the final paragraph here ends with, "Sir William here touched his repeater, which sounded 11:15. They all rose, took their candles, and retired for the night." So that is the end of that chapter. It's not really a chapter. It's just the next section of text that fits coherently together. But we do have a few changes here because Lydia is now going to make a real effort to find good in Charles Mornington. I did like this chapter for the details about everyday life that it's really hard to find anywhere else. Things like the clothes and the way they're spending their evening, the way Sir William had his own candle, and it's interesting to see them late at night without Flora and Fanny, who presumably were asleep by this time. There wasn't really much else that came out of this other than the fact that Charles Mornington is a fairly pragmatic person. He's not a romantic, and he has a very healthy appetite. And that in itself is not romantic. The thing I like most in these pages, which I forgot to mention earlier, when Charles and Lydia were outside and Lydia had picked the roses and she gave one to Charles and they were talking about the sky, Charles says one thing that Lydia liked. He said, "The lower part of the sky tonight is shaded all beautifully." And it says Lydia had some hopes of him, but he continued, "Shaded off exactly like that pretty rose-coloured ribbon you had in your straw bonnet this morning." And that ruined everything apparently, because it says he probably was not aware that a simile should rise above the subject, not fall below it. And that's something I never knew. That's something I never thought about, actually, that if you've got a simile and you've got the first part, like the lower part of the sky tonight is shaded off beautifully, what you say it's like should be more. So if you're starting off with the sky, then you've got to go into like deities or something celestial or something grander, because the first part of the simile is meant to be the smaller part. I thought that was kind of interesting. And because Charles Mornington got it wrong and he likened the sky to her bonnet string, which honestly, he probably did think more of the bonnet string than the sky. So maybe that did follow the rule, but that's not how Lydia took it at all. So that's actually all I'm going to say in this one. When we reach page 78, we're basically done with the introduction. After page 78, we actually get into the real story. And when the writing style is as heavy as it is here, it's probably best to take it in short sections anyway. So I'll leave it there, and the next video will be about pages 78 to halfway down page 101. Thank you for watching.